This video is for the purposes of discussing part 1 of Dune. This is part of the read-along that I am hosting here, but if you randomly found this video because you're a fan of Dune and want to join and discuss, welcome. Because we are discussing part 1, there will be spoilers for the entirety of part 1, and I would like to keep it spoiler-free past that, even though the first part of the Villeneuve movie goes slightly past part 1 of the book. We're focusing more on the book here, so let's keep spoilers to that point. Also, yes, my hair is different. I don't know if this is how it will stay, but I shall no longer bleach it because it was so damaging. It already feels healthier. So my plan is to pull up my notes, go over the things that stood out to me in part 1, and then ask you the things that you would like to discuss in the comments. So at the very beginning, Paul meets the Reverend Mother. She gives him kind of a weird feeling. He's not sure why. And he doesn't go to talk to her right away. He has to sleep on knowing that she's there, and then he goes to meet her the next day. And in speaking with her, he gets this feeling of wrongness. The Reverend Mother has been doing her job for a long time. She is not a young woman. She has been directing Bene Gesserit breeding for a long time. She's been interfering, directing things the way she thinks they should go. And it has probably been a very long time since anyone questioned her. As she is telling Paul about why he may be special, he just kind of gets a feeling of wrongness. And he doesn't really know why. He can't pinpoint or articulate the wrongness in what she's saying, but he knows it's there. I feel like that is probably a pretty common feeling for a teenager talking to an older person, because so often older people can get so stuck in their ways and so convinced that they are right. Nothing against old people. I plan on becoming one day. But an older person and a teenager are on opposite ends. Teenagers often have super strong feelings about things without necessarily understanding why they feel that way. I remember feeling that way. I remember hearing older people talk about the way that things are and the way things should be and thinking, no, that's not right. I can't agree, but not really being able to say why I didn't agree because I didn't have the life experience yet. This is almost more of a turning point for Paul than moving away from home. He's leaving a place he's always known for a new place. But going through his experience with the Gom Jabbar and the pain box with the Reverend Mother being tested to see if he's a human, this changes things for him internally. It makes him start to see things in a different way and to question himself. The night before they leave has one of my favorite scenes because it's one of the few scenes that just has a real sense of humor, at least to me. Humor is subjective. I love when Leto is telling Paul that he has had Mentat training. And Paul's like, I thought Mentat training started when children were very young and you didn't tell them. And then he slowly realizes, oh, duh. It's one of my favorite parts. And he has this small moment of maybe thinking that that Mentat training that he hadn't been aware of before, but now he is aware of it, maybe that is what is leading to his terrible purpose that he can now sense about his future. He thinks about it, turns it over, examines it in his mind, and realizes, no, that's not it. Might have been a relief. He talks about his terrible purpose, or he thinks about it. He knows that sometime in his future, his life is going to come to something that is not good, not positive. And if he could have just said, ah, that was it, that would have been really easy to just dismiss and get past. But it's not. His terrible purpose is still ahead. Oh, I think geriatric spice is a weird name. Like, the word geriatric is a weird word to use for it. I understand why. Geriatric having to do with, like, medical interventions for the older population. And the reason the spice is being called that is because it prolongs life. It also does other things. It kind of changes your physiology. Just seems like a weird word. I do like that it mentions how in Paul's training, his first lesson was in how to learn. Paul has received a lot more training than people his age normally get, partly because of his position, his parentage, lots of things. I'm actually going to talk about that more a little bit later. But to get a person who can learn so many things, sometimes you have to teach them how to learn, how to be open to information, how to take it in, how to mull it over, how to start at a point and continue from there, and that's something that Paul was taught. Okay, there was another moment of humor that I appreciated. I'm not sure it was meant to be humorous, but I thought it was. So when the hunter-seeker comes after Paul, Paul is at first mad at Thufir. Thufir was supposed to be the one who checked all the rooms, made sure everything was safe, gives the okay. If Thufir says it is safe, it is safe. Supposedly. Well, this got away from him, and Paul accuses him of getting old. Maybe he needs to move on. Maybe this is too much for him at his age. And Jessica defends Thufir. And I found it really interesting that then when Paul is going to talk to his father, the Duke is saying the same things that Paul was saying to Jessica. Maybe Thufir's getting old. Maybe it's time to find someone new to fill his position. And then Paul tells Leto what Jessica had been saying, and now Paul is in the position of defending Thufir. I found that interaction really interesting because it was like all the things that Jessica said and that she would have said to Leto if she was talking to him, but instead she was talking to her son. And maybe that's like some foreshadowing of how the son becomes the Duke later, and Paul has to be able to recognize the worth of a person before he becomes the Duke. I don't know. It was interesting. I liked that part. And it seems the conversations that Leto is having with Paul are getting a little on the cynical side. He's having this conversation with Paul. I don't remember if it's the same one as when they were talking about Thufir or if it's later. I think it's later. And Leto says something like, oh, it's after they're on Dune because they're sending out the propaganda. And Leto jokingly says, how will the people know how well we govern them unless we tell them? And it seemed so cynical, so negative. Like he sees, I want to use the word humor, but it's more negative than that. He sees the ridiculousness of it. And there's other things he says, and he tells Paul, I have to have somebody I can say this stuff to. And I feel like the reason he can say it to Paul is that he knows that Paul is going to have his position sooner, probably, rather than later. Or even if it is later, Paul is the one who, because he will have Leto's position, he's going to be the one feeling a lot of the same things that Leto is feeling about being in a position of leadership and how so much of it can feel fake. But you do the job that you gotta do. I like the chapter where they meet Kynes. Or Keynes? If I'd watched the movie recently, I'd probably be saying it right. I'm gonna say Kynes. Kynes is so full of himself. Oh, he's also extremely prejudiced against the government, governing bodies. He is a Dune man, and he doesn't think that the government out there in space that's not even from his planet should have the right to govern his planet. He even says what does he say? My something? My environment? I don't remember. He says something and calls it mine, and Leto thinks that's interesting that Kynes referred to it that way. Kynes is technically working for the Emperor, but he considers himself to be a man of the planet. When he sees Leto and Paul, he makes the mistake at first of thinking that their water, what does he call it? Their water, fat, flesh means that they are soft, and equates that to meaning that they are somehow weak. No, they're just from a planet that has lots of water. They've never been dehydrated in their life. Leto and Paul are not weak. They're quite strong. They just are well hydrated. On Arrakis, having water, fat, flesh represents wealth and ease of lifestyle, never having to go out into the desert. You can just sit back and sip water. And so Kynes does not have respect for someone who looks that way. And he mentions that Arrakis could be an Eden if the government wasn't grubbing for money. Spice is valuable. It's so valuable that later at the end of part 1, Paul realizes that the Fremen have been paying off the guildsmen to shield them from the guild satellites, which is why people don't know about the Fremen and where they live and their movements. The Fremen have enough spice and enough wealth to pay off the guild, and there is so much wealth there that they could terraform the planet. But you know how governments are. I won't get political, but in some ways I probably agree with Kynes. I'm from Oregon. We're environmentalists here. Oh, there's my note about it. Kynes does say my planet. I like that Paul uses his training to register Kynes through a few questions, just kind of gets Kynes talking, and uses his training to go, aha, now I know you. Or at least well enough to know if you're lying. And Kynes is really forced to face his previous beliefs. For one, about religious stuff and prophecies, but then he meets Paul, and everything that Paul says or does brings to mind for Kynes one of the lines from the prophecies. He will do this. He will know your ways as if born to them. He will not accept Paul quickly or easily, but he is a man of science, and so if there's evidence and anything can be proven, then he'll accept it. Or at least he'll think about accepting it. And then that chapter ends with Kynes thinking, I like this Duke. He witnessed Leto doing something that he would have never seen a Harkonnen do. Putting people's lives above profit, the Atreides are no Ferengi, and putting himself and his son in danger to save those men that he didn't even know personally. Okay, dinner party scene. Generally something left out in film because most of it is happening just as verbal interactions and then what the characters are thinking during those verbal interactions. There's a lot of little things like the girl sitting by Paul who has lines she's supposed to recite to lead the conversation a certain way, to make the banker look a certain way. There was one point where they're walking in to dinner and Jessica sees the girl walking with Paul and thinks, she's supposed to seduce him, isn't she? And Paul, only being 15, instead of Jessica thinking, that's my son, that's my baby, he's not ready for this, she has confidence in Paul's previous training to be able to recognize that he's being seduced. A normal 15-year-old might just be like, oh my gosh, this girl's talking to me and paying attention to me. That's just part of some of the training that Paul has had. He will have had training in how to be a Duke, how to be a leader, how to be in charge of other people. He also had Mentat training, and then all the Bene Gesserit training from Jessica. That's a lot. Paul knows lots of stuff, he is aware of a lot of stuff, and besides being able to be aware, because of the Bene Gesserit training, he can put together the information he's gaining through his observation due to his Mentat training. He's got a lot going on. Okay, the confrontation between Jessica and Thufir was pretty intense. She challenges him, are you the traitor? And he is so offended, how dare you insult me? And she says right back to him, you insulted me the same way. They both so fiercely are on the Duke's side and want to defend him. They're willing to question anything that might endanger the Duke, even if it means questioning the other person that should be the most trusted. Oh, and I hated that Leto was on his way to tell Jessica that he had never doubted her. He wants to go clear the air, and that's when he gets caught. I am glad he gave the message to Paul, because I don't think Jessica believed that Leto doubted her, but later on, when they're in the tent and Paul is giving her the message, hearing the words that her Duke should have said to her, and now the new Duke is saying to her, oh, that exacerbates her grief so much. It's probably good for her to be able to let it out and to be able to cry in that moment, because then she can get past it. Kind of like how Paul is very unfeelingly thinking it's weird that he's thinking it unfeelingly, thinking better she gets past it now, get it out of the way basically so they can move on. He's right, but he doesn't like that he's right. And that whole thing where Paul is so aware, but like outside of his awareness, where he knows he loved his father and he should be feeling similar to how Jessica is feeling, and he's not. He wonders why he's not mourning. Why can't I feel sad right now? I should. He's basically going through this weird metamorphosis. Everything in his life that has led up to this point is coming to fruition right now in changing him. This is an important step for him before going on, and if you've read the book before and you know it's past part 1, what he's going into, this change is necessary, it had to happen, and probably was brought on by moving to Arrakis where spice is in everything. That changed him physically enough that brought on his opening of his awareness, and he knows that he is not what he was supposed to be. He wasn't supposed to be the Kwisatz Haderach, but he came early, and he kind of is, but he tells Jessica, that's not really what I am. I have all that awareness. I have all the training you gave me. I'm like a Kwisatz Haderach. And I think part of what changes it is that he was also trained to be a Mentat. And also, he just came at the wrong time. He partially blames Jessica. What have you done to me? And all she can say is the truth. I gave birth to you. She was told not to. She was told to have the girl. And she had the boy. And that kind of messed things up. Messed up the Bene Gesserit's plan, messed up Paul's life. Oh, and she sees her son in distress. He's obviously suffering right now. She wants to take him in her arms and comfort him like she could have done when he was littler, and she can't do that right now. And Paul is looking down all these paths. None of them seem positive. None of the paths he can see lead to a happily ever after. I'm gonna say he has too much power for one person. And then end of part 1 ends with Paul finally being able to mourn, which honestly was still a pretty short time from finding out his father was no more to the ability to mourn. It's not like he went a long time being unfeeling. He just had to get over that change in him. So if you have been taking part in the read-along, or you're just rereading the book in anticipation of the movie, or you've read the book so many times you don't need to reread it, what are the things that stood out to you in part 1? Feel free to speak to any of the things I said, to start your own discussion, ask your own questions, whatever. Let's talk about that first part and see what you thought about it. The next discussions will take place on my community tab. I don't know if I'll do another video for part 2 and part 3, or if I'll save the next video for at the end of the whole book, at the end of watching the movies. It kind of depends on what I have time for. So keep an eye out for those discussions, and I'll see you back here. Bye. On to part 2, Muad'Dib.